When a phenomenologist speaks of phenomena, he does not mean a theory of how things appear, but an analysis of how things appear of themselves. Things are not necessarily material, for example back pain or color perception are also considered things. But more on that later, since a distinction is made between physical and mental things. Thus, phenomenology is an anti-two worlds theory as some philosophers postulate, like Plato. There is nothing real behind the phenomena. Many people, especially scientists, say that when I see a red flower, I only see the flower as red because actually the light reflecting off the flower is shining into my eyes, making the flower appear red to me. A phenomenologist would never say something like that because what appears is the real thing. The German poet and national author, basically the German Shakespeare, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe already said the beautiful sentence more than 80 years before the phenomenology was founded by Edmund Husserl, the highest would be to understand that everything factual is already theory. The blueness of the sky reveals the basic law of chromaticism. Just don't look for anything behind the phenomena, they themselves are the teaching. The last sentence is the foundation for phenomenology. Now that we know what a phenomenon is, it is interesting to know how to do phenomenology. Phenomenology is practiced subjectively from the first-person perspective, not since Husserl preferred it this way, but because you can only think from this perspective. One is always someone when one has consciousness, and that someone is subjective. There does not have to be any mediation between subject and object, the world, since one is always in the world. Nevertheless, absolute truths can be discovered from this position. Because that is the goal of phenomenology, discovering absolute truths by analyzing the specific phenomena. And only phenomenology can do that apart from math and logic. Little side note, Husserl was a mathematician and founded phenomenology later in life. He wanted to make phenomenology the mathematics of the consciousness and succeeded, that's why phenomenology seems a little bit off and often hard to grasp especially as a non-German speaker. But that's why I am trying to explain it more understandable. But back to the topic. Husserl expressed this principle of all principles as follows, back to the things themselves. If you should hear this saying in a philosophy lecture or something like that, then you now know what is meant. You go to the things without assumptions, not with expectations. All glasses must be removed, the physicist glasses or biologist glasses etc. The phenomenal event, for example how the thing shows itself to me, is the foundation for being able to do phenomenology. Meaning, to discover absolute truths. I'll try to put it in a more everyday way, science starts with the scientists. They use their experiences to develop scientific worldviews with experiments and so on. However, these experiences are experienced by someone. It's an act-object relationship, to use Husserl's vocabulary. The structure of this relationship is that someone experiences something. In order to understand this better, I have to explain to you another concept of phenomenology, namely intentionality. A former professor of Husserl coined the meaning of intentionality in phenomenology, Franz Brentano. He asked himself what is the nature of psychic acts in contrast to physical acts. He came to the conclusion that something is inherent in psychic acts. The perceived is immanent in the perceiver, the seen is immanent in the seer and so on. And this indwelling is what Brentano calls intentionality. Do not confuse intentionality with intention, the act of will. Intentionality in phenomenology is understood as a prerequisite for the act of will. Awareness is awareness about something. In the Anglo-Saxon sphere this is called aboutness. Our experience is always an experience about something, otherwise it would not be an experience. It is always focused about something. It is an act-object relationship. For example, an experience is pain. But pain is related about something, in my case back pain. Another example can be a color perception about something, like the yellow experience of the sunflower. There is always a correlation, one cannot speak of the experience without including the object experienced. Husserl understands an act as a consciousness, an experience. By object, Husserl understands what is experienced, what is that is experienced. So, intentionality is the encounter of the phenomenon with the consciousness. It's about consciousness in general, whether it's from the snake, alien or human. So, what are the essential qualities, the fundamental basic qualities, Sartre would call them characteristics, so that consciousness is consciousness? A person who believes in scientism understands everything as a material causal relation and thinks, for example, a molecule or something like that carries some information. By thinking or better believing in that, the person transmits our understanding of what information is to this molecule. However, the molecule does not know that it is carrying information because it is not aware of it. You should know that in Husserl's lifetime, logical psychologism was a dominant mindset. Husserl did not like this situation at all and refuted logical psychologism with phenomenological thinking in his work called Logical Investigations. A brief explanation of what logical psychologism is. Logical psychologism holds the belief that our logic is coupled to our empirical way of thought. That means, because we are the way we are, we think the way we think. And that means, if we thought differently, there would be other logical laws. According to the logical psychologism, logic is the art of thinking and part of psychology. I know it's crazy, but luckily that phenomenology has disproved this. And how? I will explain it now. A quote from Felix Kaufmann, phenomenologist, which refutes logical psychologism reads, "All the laws of psychology are laws of experience. Their validity is therefore only assertoric. And it is impossible to arrive at the apodictically valid laws of logic on their basis. Attempts to derive logic from psychology must therefore lead to a reinterpretation of the logical laws into laws of experience. But with this reinterpretation, which abolishes the peculiarity of logical knowledge, the possibility of every theory is abolished. Because the denial of logical, or quite generally a priori laws, includes the assertion that the terms truth, theory etc. lack any consistent meaning. With this judgment on theories in general, however, psychologism, which, like all empiricism, leads to skepticism for the reason just given, also expresses the judgment about itself, about its own theory. In its assertion it cancels itself. To put it simply in my words, logical psychologism is paradoxical because its conclusions are based on nothing. Assertoric means it could be true-false, and apodictic means it must be true or false. Another rebuttal comes from the master, Husserl himself, stating that psychologism does not recognize the difference between psychology and logic. Psychology depends on the person and their factual thinking, logic in turn is independent of it and is characterized by its ideality, it is valid a priori, apodictic. Put simply, 2 + 2 = 4, whether you have a fever, are a cat or can't swim. Logical laws are not psychological acts of thinking. According to Husserl, logical laws are intended in a sense of intentionality that I explained earlier in this video. Psychologism does not distinguish between act and object, between the object of knowledge and the act of knowing. According to Husserl, the laws of logic or mathematics are intended as ideal objects of spatiotemporally individualized psychic acts. In simpler terms, this means A times A equals the area of a square was true 1,000 years ago and will be so in 1,000 years, and each person intends the same, but the acts may differ. A times A does not dissolve in consciousness, but the act of thinking does. So, if I think for 3 seconds that A times A gives the area of a square, then this mathematical law does not stop applying when my act of thinking about it is over. Husserl also repeatedly speaks of real and ideal objects. A real object in this example would be the area of a square made of paper or some other material substance. The ideal object is A times A, which gives the formula for the area of the square, which means it is also a square. I have now prepared a quote from Husserl as he would put it, also to get an idea on how he expresses these revolutionary ideas. This will be hard to understand, but stay with me on this. The universe of objects in general that are real or imaginable for us. The actual objects are either real or ideal. The totality of realities forms a universe, the spatio-temporal world. The real is characterized by the uniqueness in which it is determined by the spatial and temporal situation. It is individual in that sense. Ideal objects have the possibility and eventual factual reality of real realization of the real occurrence in different spatio-temporal places, which therefore do not individuate them. They are then really related to realizing subjects and to documenting real things expressing them. On the part of the real subjects, when they appear in the world as realities, they are the result of certain mental activities which, if they are repeated at will by the same or other active subjects, are recognizable as identical when they occur at different places in space and time. Art and science, technology, and economics, law, and so on, appear in the historical world. They document themselves through works of art, through technical products such as tools, machines, through scientific instruments, through books of laws and so on. Husserl is interested in the condition of knowledge, both in the logical laws as the conditions of every theory and in the subjective side, also known as the notic side. Gnosis comes from the Greek and means to think. Thus, the thinking side, the act side is meant. So, the thinking process, and not the thought content. The act or notic side gives us access to ideal validity. In order to discover absolute truths, we must find out in which act the ideal is evidently given to us. The relation between objective ideality and subjective reality has to be explored, but not empirically with induction and deduction or psychologistically, but by asking what are the essentials, fundamental properties, characteristics of the given phenomenon. Husserl calls the methodology for doing this, if I translate it literally, eidetic essence vision, often also called eidetic variation, eidetic description or even eidetic reduction, but this doesn't have anything to do with reductionism. The claim here is that the essential characteristics must apply for every living being, subject, that can experience the respective phenomenon, that has the ability for these acts of consciousness. The eidetic reduction is actually the second step of the methodology. The first step is called a posh and only means that it isn't relevant if the intentionality happens in a dream, in real life, or as an illusion, etc. The phenomenon is reduced to its fundamental experience. In the next part, I will exercise an eidetic reduction on the perception of things. In this case, thing stands for a material object. The good thing is that I can easily steal the example from Husserl, since he not only founded phenomenology, but also practiced it. By explaining it with an easy practical example, all the dry input you just heard will make sense. Thanks for listening, and don't hesitate to ask questions.